My dear friend Reggie Jackson, I've never thought I'd ever have to say this to you, but I know there's a lot going on in your head right now. Uh, do you want to share a little bit of your reflections on this
Yeah,
topic?
yeah, yeah. That's great information that they've shared, Joe and John. One of the interesting things about Milwaukee in the early 1900s, it was the most foreign-born city in the country, and we had a larger percentage of foreign-born residents. So, there was kind of a normalcy in having people from different parts of Europe and living in their own, kind of segregated neighborhoods. One of the interesting things I discovered about kind of where Black people lived in the city is the area where the Menominee Valley is now. That used to be residential area. It was rezoned by city leaders in the 1920s as a way to create a barrier to prevent Black people from moving further south in the city. And so, as Blacks were forced into an area where they couldn't move either south or east or even west, they ended up, living in a community that was really a quite mixed neighborhood. We consider the neighborhood that we kind of people refer to as Bronzeville as a Black neighborhood, but it was a mixed neighborhood. About half of the residents there were actually white people, and because of racial restrictive covenants and the federal government's redlining policies, which restricted where Black people could move, they were kind of stuck in that the oldest housing stock in the city. And as John said earlier, as Black people kind of moved, they moved in the same direction that Germans moved. They moved north and west. So as Germans vacated neighborhoods, Blacks kind of moved in those neighborhoods. And so when we look at what happened with the open housing protest against it, it was really not just about open housing. It was really much more so about the fact that white people were not all that excited that the Black population had grown so rapidly. In 1940, there were only 7,500 Blacks in the city, nearly 9,000 in 1950, 21,000 in 1950, and over 62,000 by 1960, and over 100,000 by 1970. So this rapid growth in the Black population meant that Black people had to live in different neighborhoods because it was too overcrowded where they were living before. And as they encroached on those different neighborhoods, white people weren't happy. So one of the things that I tell people about the open housing marches, I think is left out of the conversation too much, is the open housing wasn't just about moving to the south side. It was actually about moving to the north side as well, neighborhoods they couldn't live in. Black people used to refer to the area north of Capitol Drive as Blackfish Bay. It was a very exclusive area that only a certain number of Blacks could live in. And so one of the sad things I think about the open housing campaign, we celebrate the successes of it, but I was able to look at a special census that was done in 1975. And it showed that in those neighborhoods on the south side, there were still barely any Black people. In most of those neighborhoods, Blacks were in single digits. So even though we celebrate the open housing marches as being successful in opening up the south side, it really didn't open up the south side. It opened up the north side and the northwest side, but the south side was still almost completely white. In fact, Blacks didn't begin to move to the south side in significant numbers until whites vacated some of those neighborhoods. Latinos moved in, and Blacks began to move into Latino neighborhoods, but they never really moved into neighborhoods with white people in great numbers on the south side.
No, I think there's a geographic sort of a really underlying reality about Milwaukee, and that's the valley. And it may have been zoned industrial, but that goes back to the 1860s. And that's a half mile wide. And I think what happened in Milwaukee, the only other example I can see in the Americas, the Cuyahoga Valley in Cleveland, sort of east side and west side of Cleveland, that's strong too. But Menominee Valley is hugely important. And I think the role it played in Milwaukee, and this goes way back to the beginning, there was this really kind of a centrifugal force moving on. So people on the north side moved north, people on the south side moved south. And kind of never the twain shall meet. It didn't matter who was there. There was very little crossing from north side to south side or vice versa. And I think what happened is, as you have first the German, then Eastern European Jewish, then African American, the foothold there is north side and the vector is always northwest. On the south side, Walker's Point was diverse. South of Mitchell south of Greenfield was largely Polish. And the displacement's just amazing. So what you have through the early decades of the 20th century, South side Polish, north side German. That was the stereotype, and it was just as segregated, as it is racially today. And this process of displacement now, south side Latino, north side African American. So the cultures are different, but the geographic patterns are pretty close, to what they were back in those early years.
We've got a question from our attendees. By the way, guys, we have 53 folks listening in right now. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for your time to come in and share this with us. We got a question about the northwest side of the city. Can you all share any thoughts about some of the neighborhoods that would be northwest side? I know we've alluded to some regions generally, but I think that question wants to get us into more that western and northern region of the city. Any thoughts you can share about that?
The big name there is Granville, which is the old township name. It goes everything from 27th to the county line, 124th Street, from Hampton up to the county line at Mequon. It's a huge area, 36 square miles. And that was annexed largely in one big by the Zeiler administration after World War II, after a lot of fighting with brown deer. They wanted it too. And what that did basically was, with some annexations in the south side, it doubled Milwaukee's land area. So that was really important to tax base and important culturally as well. One impact it had in terms of Milwaukee's culture is, again, that's the vector. African Americans moving north and west, so they settled in the old town of Granville, and that has become, places like what some of the Golden Gate, some of the areas up the northwest side, and that's become, sort of middle income African American in a lot of those sections. So housing that's suburban and everything but address, but part of Milwaukee, and that's been pretty much, very much part of the settlement by African Americans as they continue to move. So it's an important part of Milwaukee.
Well, that region does look and feel what would be traditionally Midwestern suburbia.
Absolutely.
And the layout of the homes, the streets, the sidewalks are not, there are a number of indicators of what would be Midwestern suburbia in that region.
One point of information, do you guys know
about that?
Oh, go ahead.
That part of the city, as John said, that was kind of an escape from the central city for African Americans who had, decent incomes. But what began to happen though in the 1990s, when I moved back to Milwaukee, I began to see, I didn't even know I was away from Milwaukee for about 10 years when I was in the military. When I came back, I didn't even know that Black people lived out in that part of the city. But as I came back, I was invited to parties at, people's homes and stuff out there. I began to notice that there are Black people out in that part of the city. And I had never explored that part when I was a kid. But one of the things that I started to notice in the early years I came back to Milwaukee, early 90s, is that there were more poor Black people moving out to that area. Particularly into the apartments that were out there. That part of Milwaukee has the highest concentration of apartment buildings. And so you started to see poor Black people move out there. A lot of people with Section 8 housing vouchers moved out in that area. And so you began to kind of see that area transition and look a little bit different than it had looked before. It wasn't as exclusive as it had been before.
Yeah. North Meadows, is the big one out there, 91st Street. That was very, very far removed from the sort of subsidized housing in the heart of town.
Right.
But
One point of information, the old Granville rail station on 107th and Brown Deer. Does anybody know what's in that building now? A Jamaican restaurant. It's Irie Palace. And I just looked it up. They're doing carry out and pickup. So yeah, I mean, speak of kind of progressions. Also, too, just one other thing about the northwest side of town. People are very enamored with the idea of Milwaukee being a small place. And I think it can be in some really beautiful ways. Like, I went to high school with John's son and stuff like that. But don't tell me Milwaukee's small until you know Granville. Because that is a huge swath of the city that the people who love Milwaukee as a small place would have a lot to learn. So, actually, speaking of which, I'm wearing a Rufus King hat right now.
very good. Very, very good, Adam.
I'm very provincial.
Command Central is telling us that we need to start to move to the second segment. Before we do, I want to give you folks any key thoughts, ideas about the immigrant migration experiences that you'd like to sort of wrap this section up with. Any thoughts you want to share with folks?
Let's do that in the next 3 hours.
Take your time, John. Take your time. Any
No.
thoughts at all, though, before we move?
If there's one takeaway, it's that Milwaukee's always been a city of newcomers, from the very beginning. It goes back to the early Yankees and them being uncomfortable with the Germans again. It came in, and then the Poles coming and making the Germans uncomfortable. We've always been a city of diversity, which I think is one of our most important strengths and has also been one of our most difficult sticking points.
Yeah, and I think another thing people don't realize, Milwaukee kind of started as a very segregated, space. Kilbourne Town, Juneau
Yeah,
Town,
right.
Walker's Point. So it started as a very segregated place, and we couldn't even build bridges across the rivers in town without causing people to fight over bridges and tear bridges down. So there's always been this consternation between the different groups in Milwaukee, and people are surprised at it, but that's part of how Milwaukee started.
Yeah, then it wasn't so much ethnic. It was I want money on my side.
Right.
Screw your side.
Yeah,
That's what
absolutely.
it amounted to.
Well, I think that also gets to the point of Milwaukee as being contested space, right? Starting from the beginning with white settler colonialism, and how did Milwaukee begin? Well, it began by evicting Native people from this land, and so that as being a key formation that then ends up continuing. Different groups coming in for jobs, for work. Those contests between labor and capital, and different groups coming in, old immigrants, new immigrants. These are very painful struggles that lie at the heart of what we think of as being a history of progress, right? The city from beginning to end, this line of growth, and how we imagine that is really important to how we think of the future, for sure.
I will give that man a PhD.
Ain't that America?